My mother sat across from me in the attorney's office and watched the color drain from her own face as the executor read the final clause of Uncle Harold's will. She had driven 4 hours to be at that reading. She had dressed carefully, the kind of careful that says, I am expecting something significant today. She had brought my father, who sat beside her with the specific posture of a man who has been told this trip will be worth it. They had not spoken to me in 15 years. They had walked into that office and looked at me the way people look at someone they are surprised to see briefly, and then away, as if making eye contact might complicate the transaction they had come to complete. Welcome to her Untold Nights. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing who's sitting with me for these stories. Now let's get back to where we were, because what that will said, and what my mother's face did when she heard it, is the ending of a story that started 15 years ago when I was 13 years old, and my parents chose my sister's comfort over my future. The executor read the clause slowly, because attorneys read things slowly when the content is significant. It said, in language that was precise and unambiguous, and had been written by a man who knew exactly what he was doing, that any individual who had signed the document of relinquishment attached as Exhibit A to this, the document relinquishing all claims to Harold Mercer's estate, was thereby excluded from any and all distributions therein. My mother had signed Exhibit A 15 years ago. She had signed it the same week she put me out of her house. She had signed it in exchange for something she had wanted more than her daughter's future. She had signed it, and she had forgotten she had signed it. And she had spent 15 years believing she could walk into a will reading and receive what she had not earned, and had explicitly, legally, surrendered. My name is Diana Mercer. And the story of how that document came to exist begins when I was 13 years old, on the night my parents told me to choose between my scholarship and my home. I need to tell you about the scholarship first, because I think people hear STEM scholarship and imagine something that sounds more glamorous than it actually was at 13. It was a residential STEM program at a magnet school 2 hours from our home in Raleigh, North Carolina. Full scholarship tuition, housing, meals, materials, a 4-year program starting in 9th grade, specifically designed for students who had demonstrated exceptional aptitude in mathematics and the sciences. I had applied on my own, with the help of my 8th grade math teacher, Mrs. Okafor, who had told me about the program and spent 3 Saturday mornings helping me prepare my application portfolio. I had not told my parents I was applying because I had not yet learned to predict which of my achievements would land well in our house, and which would not. I found out I had been accepted on a Thursday in April. I told my parents at dinner. My mother's response was immediate and specific. She said that the school was too far away, that I was too young to live away from home, and that my sister Priya, who was 11 and who had my mother mentioned been having a hard year, needed me around. I said I wanted to go. My mother said she would think about it. My father said nothing, which was his primary contribution to most family discussions of any significance. What followed was 2 months of conversations that I remember, from this distance, as the slow solidification of something that had always been there but that I had managed, until then, to not fully see. My parents loved Priya with the specific intensity of people who have decided, somewhere along the way, that one child needs more, and that the other can absorb the difference. Priya was younger, softer, more openly in need of reassurance in a way that my parents found easier to respond to than my self-sufficiency. I had always been capable, and I had always been told that capability was a virtue, and I had not yet understood that in my particular family, being capable primarily meant being available to compensate for everyone else. The scholarship conversation became, over those 2 months, a negotiation I had not understood I was in until I was too far into it to see the shape of it clearly. My mother talked about Priya constantly, Priya's anxiety, Priya's need for stability, Priya's relationship with me as her older sister, how much it would damage Priya if I left. My father occasionally seconded these concerns with vague, non-committal sounds of agreement. Neither of them talked about my opportunity. Neither of them talked about what I wanted or what I had earned. In June, 2 weeks before I would have needed to confirm my enrollment, my mother sat me down and told me I had to choose. The scholarship or my family. Those were the words she used. Not "we'd prefer you stay" or "we're worried about this decision." The scholarship or my family. I was 13 years old. I chose the scholarship. I don't say that as a boast, I say it as a fact about who I was at 13, which is that I was a child who had been told implicitly and repeatedly that her needs came last, and who had developed a very early and very clear understanding that the only person reliably looking out for her future was herself. That understanding, at 13, looked like courage. From the inside, at the time, it felt like terror. My parents told me to leave. Not immediately, they gave me a week to arrange where I would go, which I think they believed would be enough time to make me change my mind. It was not. I called my Uncle Harold. Harold Mercer was my mother's older brother. He was 51 years old at that time, a widower, a mechanical engineer who had done very well for himself and who lived alone in a large house in Charlotte that he had always said felt too quiet. He and my mother had a complicated relationship, the kind that develops between siblings when one succeeds more visibly than the other, and neither of them has the vocabulary to discuss it. He had always been kind to me, in the specific, attentive way of a person who notices children rather than simply managing them. I called him from the school library payphone on a Tuesday afternoon, and I told him what had happened in the most factual terms I could manage, which was not very factual because I was 13 and crying. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Diana, do you want to come live with me?" I said yes. He said, "Then come. I'll sort out the details." You focus on the scholarship. He sorted out the details. It took 2 phone calls and a week 1 call to my parents to inform them of the arrangement, and 1 call to an attorney named Patricia Webb to begin putting certain things in writing. I did not know about the second call at the time. I would not fully understand it until I was sitting in a different attorney's office, 15 years later, watching my mother's face change. Let me tell you what happened in the weeks after I moved to Charlotte, because the document my mother signed, the one that would come back 15 years later, was created in those weeks. And understanding it requires understanding the specific shape of what my parents wanted at the time. My parents were angry. Not, I think, primarily because I had left, I believe, on some level. They had expected me to stay, and had been genuinely surprised when I called their bluff. The anger was more complicated than simple parental hurt. It was the anger of people who had made a calculation about their family's resources, emotional, practical, financial, and had had that calculation disrupted by a 13-year-old who turned out to be more determined than they had accounted for. They called Harold 3 times in the first 2 weeks. I was present for none of the calls, but Harold told me about them afterward with the careful, honest simplicity that characterized everything he told me. My parents wanted 2 things. The first was for Harold to send me home, which he declined to do, calmly and finally. The second was more complicated. They wanted Harold to agree, formally, that in exchange for their cooperation with the arrangement, meaning their agreement not to pursue any legal challenge to me living with him, Harold would ensure that my mother would be included in any future estate distribution. Harold was wealthy. My mother knew this. She had always known this, and she had, I think, been managing her relationship with her brother with at least one eye on that eventual inheritance for a long time. Harold told me this with a very specific expression, not contempt, but a kind of sad clarity. He said, "Your mother offered to let you go, Diana, in exchange for a promise about my will. I want you to know that." I was 13. I didn't fully know what to do with that information. I filed it somewhere deep and went back to preparing for the scholarship program. What my mother did not know, what she apparently did not read carefully enough to understand at the time, was that Harold had agreed to put something in writing. Just not what she had asked for. Harold had called Patricia Webb, his attorney, and had Patricia draft a document that my mother signed in the presence of a notary believing she was signing an agreement that secured her place in Harold's estate in exchange for her cooperation with the custody arrangement. What she was actually signing, what the document clearly stated, in language that Patricia Webb had specifically designed to be unambiguous, was a relinquishment of all claims to Harold Mercer's estate, in exchange for a one-time payment of $5,000 and a formal letter acknowledging the custody arrangement. My mother had signed away her inheritance for $5,000 and a letter. Whether she had not read it carefully, or had read it and not understood it, or had understood it and convinced herself it didn't mean what it said, I have never known. What I know is that she signed it, took the $5,000, and spent the next 15 years apparently believing that the document said something different from what it said. That was peak one, the document and its creation. What followed was 15 years, and I want to walk you through the shape of them, because the shape matters. I went to the magnet school. I was by any measure exactly where I was supposed to be, surrounded by students who thought the way I thought, challenged by teachers who expected more than I had ever been expected to produce, living in Harold's guest room on weekends and holidays, slowly, tentatively, building a relationship with a man who had chosen to show up for me when the people who were supposed to show up had not. Harold was not a replacement for my parents, I want to be honest about that. He was something different. A person who had decided, freely and without obligation, that I was worth investing in. He came to every school event he could reach. He asked real questions about my work. He built a small laboratory in his basement, nothing extravagant, basic equipment, because he said that a girl who liked science should have somewhere to do science on weekends. He never tried to be my father. He was Harold, which turned out to be more than enough. My parents contacted me twice in 15 years. The first time was when I was 21, 2 years into my engineering degree at NC State, when my mother sent a card, not a letter, a card that said she hoped I was doing well and that Priya was getting married and it would mean a lot if I could come to the wedding. I did not go to the wedding. I sent a gift. I did not hear from them again for 6 years. The second contact came when I was 27. My father called, not my mother, my father, which told me that what was coming was something my mother didn't want to deliver herself. He said that things had been difficult financially, that Priya's husband's business had had some problems, that they were behind on some bills. He said he didn't want to ask, but he was asking. I said I was sorry to hear things were difficult. I did not send money. I hung up. That was peak 2, the 2 contacts, both self-serving, neither of them an attempt at anything resembling a real relationship. What they told me, across 15 years, was that my parents had not changed in the specific way that would have made reconciliation possible. They still did not think about me except when they needed something, and the something they needed was always some version of what they had always taken: my resources, my compliance, my participation in their lives on their terms. Peak 3 was Harold's illness. He was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 3 years ago, at 78. It moved quickly, the way pancreatic cancer does. I took a leave of absence from my job. I was a senior engineer at a renewable energy firm by then. Work I loved. Work Harold had been proud of in a way that was visible every time I described it to him, and I moved back into the Charlotte house to be with him through the final months. Those months were among the most painful and most important of my life. Harold, in the way of people who have always been precise and prepared, had organized everything: his legal affairs, his medical directives, his wishes for the house and his possessions and the people who mattered to him. He and Patricia Webb had updated his will twice in the preceding decade, most recently 18 months before his diagnosis, and he had told me clearly and directly what it contained. He had left everything to me: the house in Charlotte, his investment accounts, his engineering patents, a collection of first edition science books he had been building for 40 years. Everything, he said, sitting in his living room on an afternoon when the light was very good. You are the family I chose, Diana. Everything I have goes to the family I chose. I held his hand. I did not cry in front of him. I cried after, in the kitchen, for a long time. Harold passed away on a Tuesday in October. He was peaceful. I was with him. 3 weeks later, Patricia Webb called to schedule the will reading. She mentioned that she had sent formal notification to all parties named in the estate documents, including, as legally required, the individual named in Exhibit A. I asked who had been notified via Exhibit A. Patricia said, "Your mother Diana, as the party to the relinquishment agreement, she was entitled to formal notification of the estate proceedings." I said, "Does she know what Exhibit A says?" Patricia said, very carefully, "She will when she arrives at the reading." I arrived at Patricia's office 15 minutes early. I sat in the waiting room with a cup of coffee I didn't really want, and I thought about Harold, about the Tuesday morning light in his bedroom, about the specific weight of his hand in mine at the end, about the first edition copy of Feynman's lectures on physics that he had given me on my 16th birthday with a note inside that said, "For the engineer I always knew you'd become." I was thinking about that book when my parents walked in. I had not seen them in 15 years. My mother was 63, now she had been 48 when I left, young enough that the distance between then and now felt enormous in her face. My father was behind her, heavier than I remembered, moving with the slight, careful quality of a man whose joints had begun to register his age. My mother looked at me. I looked at her. There was a moment, just a moment, that I think was genuine. The specific, unguarded recognition of a parent looking at a child they have not seen in a very long time. The involuntary inventory of who that child has become. She looked at me, and something moved in her face that was not calculation and was not performance. I believe it was real. Then it passed, and she sat down 2 seats away from me without speaking, and my father sat beside her, and we waited for Patricia. Patricia conducted the reading with the efficiency and dignity I had come to expect from her over 15 years of occasional contact. She read the will in full, the bequests, the asset distributions, the charitable donations Harold had specified, the disposition of the house and its contents. My name appeared throughout. My mother's name did not appear in the main body of the document at all. When Patricia reached the final section, the Exhibit A clause, the relinquishment, she read it carefully and completely, the way she had read everything else, without particular emphasis or drama. The language was clear. Any individual who had signed the document of relinquishment attached as Exhibit A was excluded from any and all distributions. Then Patricia reached into a folder and produced a copy of the document, my mother's signature at the bottom, notarized, dated 15 years ago, 1 week after I moved to Charlotte. She placed it on the table. My mother looked at it for a long time. Then she said, "I don't understand what this is." Patricia said, "Mrs. Osai, this is the document you signed in October 15 years ago, in the presence of a notary. It is a relinquishment of all claims to Harold Mercer's estate." My mother said, "That's not what I signed. I signed an agreement about Diana's living arrangement." Harold agreed to include me, and Patricia said, very calmly, "The document you signed is the document in front of you. I drafted it myself. Its language is unambiguous." My mother looked at me. Her eyes were bright in the way eyes go bright when something is fighting its way to the surface. She said, "Diana, did you know about this?" I said, "Harold told me what the document said when I was 13. I didn't fully understand the legal implications at the time. I understood them better as I got older." She said, "He tricked me." I said, very carefully, "He gave you a document that said exactly what it meant, and you signed it." Harold never tricked anyone in his life. He was the most straightforward person I have ever known. My father put his hand on my mother's arm. She did not look at him. She was still looking at me, and her expression had moved through several things: shock, anger, something that looked briefly like grief and had arrived at something I had not expected. It looked, at the end, like a specific kind of exhaustion. The exhaustion of a person who has been carrying a story for 15 years and has just been shown that the story was wrong. She said quietly, "What are you going to do with it?" "All of it?" I said, "I'm going to take care of it the way Harold would have wanted. I'm going to keep the house. I'm going to honor the charitable bequests, and I'm going to continue building the life he believed I was capable of building. She said, Diana, we have nothing. Your father's health, Priya's situation, we have very little left. I said, Mom, I know. I'm sorry about that. I genuinely am. But I was 13 years old, and you told me to choose between my future and my family. And I chose my future, and you chose to let me go. Harold was there when you weren't. What he left me is a reflection of who was present, not who shared my blood. She didn't say anything after that. Patricia concluded the meeting. My parents left. I sat in Patricia's office for a few minutes after they were gone, finishing the coffee I still didn't really want, and I thought about Harold, and I thought about the first edition Feynman, and I thought about a Tuesday morning in October when the light was very good. My mother came to the Charlotte house 3 weeks after the will reading. She did not call ahead. She drove 4 hours and knocked on the front door of the house I had grown up in on weekends. The house where Harold had built a small laboratory in the basement for a 13-year-old who liked science. The house where I had spent more holidays than I could count, eating Harold's cooking and watching him lose badly at chess. I opened the door. She was alone. My father had not come, which I think was a deliberate choice on her part, an acknowledgement that this was a conversation between the two of us rather than a family negotiation. She looked smaller than she had at the attorney's office. Not physically, she is not a small woman, but in the specific way that people look smaller when they are not certain of their ground. She said, Can I come in? I said yes. I made tea. We sat at Harold's kitchen table, my kitchen table now, though I still thought of it as his. She looked around the kitchen in the way my mother had always looked at things Harold owned, taking inventory, assessing, understanding value. Then she looked at me. And this time, the inventory felt different. This time I think she was assessing something else. She said, I want to explain some things. About when you were 13. I said, okay. What followed was an hour that I will not fully recount here, because some of it belongs to my mother and me, and not to any wider audience. What I will tell you is the shape of it. She talked about what she had been carrying, and I listened. She talked about the specific fear she had had when I was accepted to the scholarship program, not primarily about Priya, as she had told me at the time, but about herself, about the specific terror of a mother who looks at her capable daughter and understands, somewhere in herself, that she can't fully articulate, that this daughter is going to leave, and has been going to leave for a long time, and that the scholarship is just the first door. She said she had chosen Priya because Priya seemed to need her, and choosing someone who needed you felt safer than holding on to someone who was already, at 13, on her way out. I said, You could have said that, Mom, at the time. You could have said you were scared instead of giving me an ultimatum. She said, I know. I didn't know how. I said, I know you didn't. We sat with that for a while. She did not ask for money at that visit. I want to be clear about that, because I think the story implies she came to ask and she did not that day. What she came for, I think, was something she couldn't fully name, some version of seeing me, of understanding who I had become, of standing in the house where her brother had raised her daughter and trying to understand what that meant about the choices she had made. She asked about my work. I told her. She asked about the house, what I was planning to do with it. I told her I was keeping it, that I had requested a transfer to my company's Charlotte office, that I intended to live there. She looked around Harold's kitchen again, and this time her expression was not assessment. It was something closer to grief. She said, He loved you very much. I said, Yes, he did. She said, I'm glad he was there. I'm glad you had him. It was, I think, the truest thing she had said to me in my entire adult life. I received it as such. She left in the early afternoon. She hugged me at the door briefly, carefully, the hug of two people who are finding the edges of something and have decided not to push past them yet. I watched her car until it turned out of the driveway, and then I went back inside. My father called 2 weeks later. He did ask about financial help briefly, carefully, with the embarrassed directness of a man who has been asked to make a call he didn't want to make. I said I would think about it. What I thought about, over the following week, was not whether to help, but how, not from obligation, not from guilt, but from a deliberate, examined choice about what kind of person I wanted to be, and what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted to build going forward. I set up a modest monthly transfer. Not large, not life-changing for them, not significant to me, enough to help with the bills my father had mentioned, not enough to be a blank check, structured as a choice I was making rather than a debt I was paying. I told my father directly, "This is not inheritance. It is not guilt money. It is a decision I am making because I choose to, and I reserve the right to change my mind at any time." He said, "That's more than fair, Diana." I said, "I know. Priya has not contacted me. I hold no particular feeling about that. She is her own person, shaped by her own version of our family, and whatever relationship she and I might someday have will have to be built from where we actually are, not from where we might have been if things had been different. I am not waiting for it. I am also not closing the door. I live in Harold's house now. My house. I have kept his study mostly as it was: the bookshelves, the desk, the framed photographs of projects he worked on over 40 years of engineering. I added the first edition Feynman to the shelf, next to the other first editions he collected, where it belongs. I work in the Charlotte office. I go to the farmer's market on Saturday mornings, which Harold always did, and which I have continued, because it turns out I like it more than I expected. I have made a few friends in the neighborhood, the couple next door, who knew Harold for 20 years and who have, quietly and kindly, begun including me in the small rituals of the street. It is not a dramatic life. It is mine. Completely, specifically, irreducibly mine, built from a scholarship I earned at 13, and a man who said "come" when no one else was saying anything, and 15 years of showing up for myself the way he had shown up for me. I think about Harold every day. I think about him the way you think about someone whose love has become part of the structure of who you are, not as a memory you visit, but as something load-bearing, something that holds things up. I think that is what real family does. It holds things up. If someone abandoned you, if the people who were supposed to stay chose, at some point, to leave, I want to say something to you directly. You did not need their permission to become who you are. You needed, perhaps, the right door to be open at the right moment, a scholarship, a phone call, a person who said "come" without conditions. But the becoming was yours. It has always been yours. Family is about who chooses to stay. I learned that at 13, standing in a school library with a payphone receiver in my hand, calling a man who was not obligated to say yes, but who said yes anyway. I have spent 15 years understanding the full weight of that yes, what it cost him, what it built in me, what it means to be chosen by someone who had every reason not to choose you and did it anyway. Setting a boundary with people who have hurt you is not punishment. It is not cruelty. It is the simple, necessary act of understanding what you owe and what you don't, and acting on that understanding clearly, without drama, in a way that allows you to remain the person you have worked to become, rather than reverting to the person their treatment of you was designed to produce. I did not forgive my parents in a single afternoon at a kitchen table. I have been forgiving them, slowly and imperfectly, for 15 years, not for their sake, but for mine, because carrying that much unprocessed hurt takes up space that I would rather use for other things. Forgiveness, I have come to understand, is internal housekeeping. Reconciliation is a different question entirely, and it is a question only I get to answer. You don't need anyone's permission to know your worth. That was the lesson Harold gave me, not through speeches or grand gestures, but through the accumulated, daily evidence of a man who simply showed up, who came to the school events, who built the laboratory, who made sure that when I looked at my life, I could see, clearly and without ambiguity, that someone had decided I was worth showing up for. I hope you have someone like that. And if you don't yet, I hope you know that the absence of that person does not mean you are not worth showing up for. It means you haven't found them yet. Keep looking. They exist. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story resonated with you, if you know what it means to be chosen by someone when you most needed it, I'd love to hear about it in the comments.